Okay, moving on, we are going to talk about art of the Americas, the indigenous Americas. And as we travel to different cultures in our different content areas, I want you to make note that we're going to be kind of going back into time. This is going to be more of a overall look at these cultures. And so we're going to be going back into BCE era a little bit, and then some of these content areas will take us into um, contemporary and modern times. So I just want you to understand that as we visit these other content areas that focus on other cultures, our timeline is going to be kind of overarching and encompassing again. A few AP enduring understandings, just as we're really shifting gears here, want you to make sure kind of what AP's goals are for these cultural content areas. So specifically to our Indigenous Americas, that you are aware that they are among some of the oldest art traditions in the world, that Mesoamerican art from Mexico to Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize is characterized by a lot of architectural structures such as pyramids, a lot of influence on astronomy, the calendar system, rituals, and green objects. So objects that are like native to the environment, native to the land. Um, that Andean art, which is more kind of modern day South America, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, relies on a lot of shamanistic rituals that involve a lot of veneration for the natural world. And then when we look at North American, specifically the North American Indian, that they have undergone widespread persecution and cultural reshaping since the arrival of Europeans. And then the modern Native American that we'll be looking at maintain active cultural identities today. So that is AP's enduring understandings, like their objectives for you for this content area. And I want to make sure that when we talk about the Americas or the Indigenous Americas, you geographically understand what it is we're talking about, because we will not always be using contemporary terminology. So the first is understanding Mesoamerica, and that's what we know now as kind of that current day Mexico. I have a more of a global picture, but Mesoamerica is Central America here that connects North and South America. When we look at South America, that will be referred to more as the Andean Americas. And then when we look into North America, it's going to be kind of divided up into like tribal regions. We won't be hitting all of them, but we have over here the eastern woodlands. In the center, we have the plains. Then here we have the southwest. Way up here in the north, we have the northwest coastal. And then here we have the intermountain. So again, we're not going to be hitting on all of these areas, but it's important to understand the terminology that AP uses when talking about kind of these cultural regions, because we won't always use the contemporary names and terminologies. I kind of broke this content down into periods and civilizations throughout all of the Americas. And so, in terms of civilizations, these are the civilizations that we will be covering. So, the Chavin, the Mayan, the Anasazi, the Mississippian, the Aztec, the Incan, and the Native North American. And then the time periods that will be covered for those civilizations. So the Chavin will be kind of the oldest from 900 to 200 BCE. Next, we have the Mayan, which will be 300 to 900 CE and later. The Anasazi is from 550 to 1400 CE. Mississippian 800 to 1500 CE. The Aztec from 1400 to 1521 CE. The Incan from 1438 to 1532, and then the Native North American we will cover from 18th century to present. And then these are kind of the locations. I did both, contemporary terminology and also kind of the AP terminology. So the Chavin will be modern day coastal Peru. Mayan is Mesoamerican, so you have Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and the Yucatan. The Anasazi, that is the North American, Native American, but the Southwest West region. The Mississippian is the kind of eastern United States Native American. The Aztec is central Mexico, specifically Mexico City. The Incan is Peru, and then the Native North American will be kind of all areas of North America. This screencast is going to be a two-parter. So again, I'm going to be covering 3 civilizations in part 1 and then the remaining civilizations in part 2. Just an overall historical background on the Americas, especially the things that AP wants you to understand contextually and historically. First, that humans are not native to the New World, to this Native American region. That technically Americans do not have ancestry dating back millions of years like Africa and Asia. So when we look back at that prehistoric art, our first content area, it was important to understand that the first signs of civilization were in Africa and Asia. And so reminding you that that is true and that there are no, you know, indigenous people to the Americas, that all people, all signs of humans, and all sorts of civilization came from people that migrated from Asia over a span of 30,000 years. Once they had settled and climate started to allow for crops, populations grew, and then civilizations were established. And that's where we're going to be starting. That's what we're going to be looking at when we start looking at, these early civilizations like the Chapin. Like everywhere, of course, there were rivalries, jealousies, quests for expansion, and of course, it tore civilizations apart, ended, completely wiped out certain civilizations as well, but, also ultimately blended and cultivated with each other. And although it wasn't until the European colonizers arrived when these primitive cultures transferred into a more sophisticated society, but again, um, really, really changing the pre-existing culture completely. So this is going to be quite a theme on some of our content areas where we go into more ancient and tribal civilizations. You're going to see this theme of colonization and, basically a lot of cultures that have been lost once that has happened. And so this is prevalent in our Indigenous America um, um, content area. You're going to see it again when we get into South Pacific and some African um, content area as well. Most American artists were commoners, but like other, ancient world societies, thinking back to like Egyptians and Mesopotamia, their special skills and abilities, though, did allow them to be employable and revered and to work, more important jobs. Um, Ancient Americans, though, definitely used local resources as materials for artwork, and they were items that were definitely based off of their environment and their climate. So that's going to bring us to our first civilization in the screencast. We're going to look at Chavin art, and I'm starting kind of each civilization with just a little bit of background on them because, again, they're very unique in their own way, and they have very specific characteristics that is going to cover kind of a lot of your contextual information for each civilization that we go over. So I have a lot of this information kind of bullet pointed for you to add into your graphic notes. But basically, the Chavin was a civilization named after its main archaeological site. I put a map over here just so you can get your bearings of where we are. So we're in the Andean civilization, so modern day South America and what we would know as Peru. But the Chavin really was very coastal. Okay, unlike when we get into the Incans, they were more inland. So Chavin was a coastal civilization. Um, it's The Chavin art basically is really, really dominated by figural compositions, often shown in this combination of human and animal motifs, like a blend of both human and animal qualities. Many figures will unite various animal forms into one being, kind of like a mashup per se. We'll have fanged mouths, that are merged with, serpents for hair, and figures are generally very heavily rendered with an eye for monumentality. Um, Symmetry is also extremely desired and extremely executed. You're going to see a lot of repeated motifs and repeated patterns, and all the sculptures that we'll see or are all very low bas relief, and that is primarily because of their access to tools at the time. They only worked with stone and bronze tools, so they were really only able to dig and carve so deep into, their um, lintels and their kind of flat stones that you'll be seeing. Um, the artworks were not just carved in low relief, but on a polished surface, and usually in a very kind of rectangular or square format. A lot of geometry would also go into their very, very kind of bold two-dimensional designs. Now, in terms of architecture, the Chavins definitely were about choosing a very dramatic site. It was all, and you're going to kind of see that theme, especially in the Andean region, where civilization settled really for the drama and the beauty of the land, of the architectural site. Sometimes it would be mountaintops, but really a lot of their buildings were meant to kind of interact with the scenery. So, like the building that we're about to see for the Chavin was built around this U-shaped plan that really embraced kind of the lookout onto this beautiful, expansive coastal view. You'll also see a lot of very stepped platforms that would raise the buildings, and make them, appear taller and more ceremonial. Sometimes these sites were constructed around the cardinal points, but not always. And so, really, there was just a lot of care into the civilization, and where buildings were erected, and really kind of what their views were. Um, so moving onward, that's going to bring us to this structure that I was talking about, this U-shaped structure. And this brings us to our first image, 153, and the title is Chavín de Huántar, and this is located in the northern highlands of Peru. We're looking at about 900 to 200 BCE, and the materials are stone and granite. And so this is the basic structure when I talked about the U shape, okay? So all the buildings were constructed in this U shape. This was kind of a open, sunken plaza that was, open, and then this allowed for all of the view. Um, Within this screencast, I have posted what I feel are very, very necessary videos. And since I cannot play the videos for you in the screencast, when I post the Google Slides, I really highly, truly recommend that you take the 3 minutes that it takes to watch one of these videos to really help you give a true understanding of the essence of the artwork. And especially because a lot of it is architectural, it will give you a better understanding of the three-dimensionality of things, how humans interacted with these structures, and it'll just give you a much better kind of visual and overall grasp of these ruins that we are talking about. So again, it's highly recommended. I choose them. They're there for a reason. They're not just extra or filler. So basically, what this behaved as, its function as, it was the religious capital. The temple itself was 60 meters tall, and the Chavins are known for their jaguar. So the jaguar was their symbol of power. So you will see a lot of relief sculptures that are highlighting the jaguar. A lot of sculptures highlight the jaguar. That was their identifiable like animal symbol of power. What One of the things that's super interesting about this complex is that at the temple, and that's what this video shows you, at the temple there is this hidden entrance. And within that hidden entrance, there's all of these corridors that literally form this maze underground of these, hallways that intersect and wind. And this hidden maze leads to an oracle, which will be our next image on the next slide. This is an image down here of kind of today what these ruins look like, these stone buildings, and how they look today, and basically giving you an understanding of this entire kind of plaza, this entire religious center. Within the religious center, we're going to have some other features that are part of Chavín de Huántar. And like I said to you in the last slide, there was this underground maze-like corridors that as you kind of pilgrimaged your way through these corridors, that it would lead to this lands on stone. And so that is our next image, number 153, the lands on stone, again from 900 to 200 BCE, and this is also stone and granite. And so it's inside the temple, the Chavan Temple. And at the center, the very center of this maze-like system underground, is this large stone. And the Lanzon stone is translates to blade or spear in Spanish. And I put this image over here on the left so that you could see kind of the actual three-dimensional shape of this stone, and that from a side view, you can see how it really does mimic kind of the shape of a spear or a blade. From the frontal view, it's hard to see that, but it is kind of flattened and blade-like. It stands 15 feet tall, so it's very, very tall, especially for an underground structure that's built inside these corridors. What we are seeing here, this bas relief carving, I've given you kind of a black and white drawing of it here in the center so that it's a little bit easier to see. But it depicts this powerful figure that again is part human, part animal. It has the face of a jaguar. This is the common depiction of the jaguar face that you will see repeated quite often in the Chavan culture. It has snakes and serpents around its head. The eyebrows kind of terminate into snakes. It's very curvilinear pattern, very geometric, but has lots of curves to it. And the function of this was like an oracle. It was a cult figure, and it was the center of the pilgrimage. But however, to get to this depth, to get to the center of these corridors, not everybody was allowed. Only few had access, and that was really kind of like the leaders of the civilization, just the few chosen that were able to consult the oracle and kind of be in the presence of the oracle. So this was not for everybody that was part of the culture. Modern scholars hypothesize that the stone acted as a place, an oracle, which is a place where you kind of have that like shamanistic ability to receive like messages from the gods and kind of as an act of guidance. This is image number 153, still part of this Chavan de Hunotar religious complex. And this is titled A Granite Relief Sculpture. And basically this is a ruin of the kind of the walls of the stairway at Chavan. And basically what we're looking at here is that jaguar symbol. But what is so unique about a lot of these like Andean patterns is that they're kind of they're repeated in a never-ending way. So you can see it's kind of the same pattern repeated over and over again, but in a way where they also kind of continuously intersect. And that's a very stylistic trait that you want to make note of and be familiar with, that they kind of blend together and intersect each other, even though it's a repeated pattern. You can see, really clear evidence here about how low relief their carvings were because of the use of very simplistic and unsophisticated tools, but at the same time creating these wonderful curvilinear, lines and patterns that are actually very, very complex when you try to kind of follow the nature of the intersecting patterns. This is also still part of this Chavan culture. It's image 153. It's called Nose Ornament, and it's made of gold alloy. And, this is just included as, just a Chavin art piece. This was worn by both male and females under the nose. So right here is kind of like a septum. You would kind of clip it on the center of your nose where your septum is, and then these snake heads would kind of go in front of your cheeks. So it was held in place by this semicircular section at the top, kind of pinching your center septum. The function of it was it was ornamental, but it was also a status symbol. It showed devotion, but also it was just kind of an aesthetic purpose of jewelry in general. But like all jewelry, even today, it also shows a status symbol. And really, in terms of tradition, working with metal was kind of new and recent to the Andes. So this is an important piece because it's one of our earliest examples of wrought gold from this region. It was made by hammering and cutting, but of course, more advanced techniques would later develop. But again, it's important because it's one of the earliest evidences of metal work in this Andes region. Moving on to our next civilization, we're going to look at the Mayan art. And again, I have some bullet points of some important kind of historical and artistic information about the Mayan culture. Um, I really enjoy the information that AP has about Mayan art because it's actually, um, I think, very, very interesting, but at the same time, not depicted in any of our required images for Mayan art. So I find that, very strange, but I think it's important to also know this information as well. So Mayan sculpture is really easy to recognize because Mayans had this very original and unusual concept of their ideal beauty. Um, the model beauty seems to be a figure with this huge like arching brow, but the indentation like above the nose is filled in to create this like continuous bridge between the forehead and the nose so that there is no dip in between. And a lot of very well-to-do Mayans would actually put their children in head braces to help create this symbol of beauty if the child was not necessarily born with this feature of beauty. So they would actually, kind of mold and shape the heads to help kind of create this feature. Um, Facial types that were considered really beautiful were very long and narrow, but having full lips and mouths that were always kind of slightly open, as if ready to speak. It's common to see figures very elaborately dressed with full costumes composed of fine materials such as feathers and jade and jaguar skins. And the Mayans also definitely preferred more narrative art done in relief sculpture. So narrative meaning that, it really would tell a story. It wasn't just about symbols, but it would actually convey a story. And their relief work was not as low relief as the Chavin culture. It was a little bit deeper relief work, but it had very, very crisp outlines, but still just very simple and bold, but very deep, more deep, crisp outlines and a little bit more carving out of the negative space. Um, Mayan sculpture is typically related to architectural monuments, so lintels, facades, jambs. So a lot of their sculptures were kind of part of their architecture. Figures of gods are very stylized and placed in, possessing symbols of beauty, um, things like tattooing. Crossed eyes was also a symbol of beauty. The specifically shaped faces and heads, adornment with jewelry, and also their sculptures were very brightly painted. But another really common art form of the Mayans that again is just super stylized to this culture, was called the Chachmul. And what the Chachmul is a figure that's in a very awkward position. Like if you kind of think about the you know the Etruscan sarcophagi and how they would show the matrimony sculptures in these very awkward kind of reclining positions. Well, the chakmul is just like that. So it would be a figure that is half sitting, half lying on its back. The pose of the figure is kind of in balance because the head would then be turned 90 degrees from the body, and the elbows would be, firmly rested on the ground, and, having this like sloping sense to the body, almost like a very uncomfortable, recline of the body. But then also on the stomach, you would see a plate. And a lot of people believe that this plate was a place where that was meant to receive offerings. So I have an example down here, of the Chakmul figure. So again, you have this kind of uncomfortable recline with bent knees, elbows firmly on the ground, head turned to a 90 degree, and then the stomach is always flattened with a plate meant for offerings. And then in these other images, I'm trying to show you kind of that ideal look of beauty and that kind of sculpted face. So the dip between the nose and the brow does not exist. It's just kind of this unbreak of a line. Same here, that you have, very large lips that, are slightly opened, and that you have, kind of these elongated skulls. And this is an example of kind of binding of the head to help kind of shape, um, you know, mold and shape the head. Now, getting into our images for Mayan art, we're starting here, image 155, and this is the city of Yachilan. And what is important to understand about this image is that it is an entire city complex set on a high terrace, and it's a plaza surrounded by very important buildings. The other images to follow are, of course, going to be, details of this plaza with some of these buildings. But before we get into the specific buildings, it is important to understand kind of the grand complex of it. Um, so this city, this complex, is located, right here. So this is, modern day Mexico and Guatemala, and this winding river that separates. And then it has this really amazing kind of circular, curve to this river. And Yachilan had settled, right there, within that circle. It flourished from about 300 to 800 CE, and basically, the Mayan culture and a lot of these kind of, early American civilizations, drew heavily on their civilizations before them. So the Mayan culture drew heavily from their Toltec and Olmec forerunners, and then the Mayans, are responsible for then giving birth to the later Aztec culture. So it's kind of like this, development of, cultures and civilizations. So knowing that Yaxchilan is, this city complex, now we're going to look at some details of it. And these structures that we're going to be looking at, or these buildings, are literally titled by numbers. So it's hard to see on this map, but a lot of these structures are just kind of numbered, and that's their title, um, you know, in our slides here. So image number 55 is Yaxchilan, but structure number 40, and it's made of limestone, and it's in current Chiapas, Mexico. But what we're looking at here in the structure, they believe the function of this and the origin of this building secured the rule of Bird Jaguar II and depicted his lineage and his right to rule. So primarily the function of this building was a political building. It overlooks the main plaza. We are looking at 3 doors here that lead to one central room. The interior of the building is covered in, stucco, so you're not seeing the stone on the inside. It's been coated with a stucco. The roof, the original roof on structure 40, remains nearly intact. And what we see up here, this kind of decorative architectural element for the Mayan structures, is called a roof comb. And that's definitely something you're going to need to know for this specific culture within this content area, is this roof comb. We're not going to see it again. So it's very specific to this Mayan culture. And the inside of the of this room has a corbelled vaulted interior. Corbel vaulted means that it's kind of stair steps, the stones stair step on the interior to give you kind of like this taller vaulted ceiling. Notice too that, we talked about these structures that were also, kind of built up on these platforms. So this is what we're seeing here. You can see that these platforms were built up with stone walls, and then, on these different levels, laid with earth, so grasses would grow, and then kind of wide stair steps up to the structure itself. Image number 53 is another structure. This is structure 33, and this is also limestone. This temple, though, definitely has gone through some restoration processes. We are looking again at this beautiful roof architectural element called the roof comb. Now, the actual ceiling of the building does not go on top of the roof comb. The roof comb is literally just a decorative element on top to make the exterior of these structures appear to be bigger, but the interior ceilings are not that tall. Again, we have 3 central doorways that lead to one large worship room. Again, you have that corbel arched interior. What we are looking at here in terms of content, you can see there's a lot of like kind of sculptural depiction, and there's a figure carved into the central niche that they believe is Bird Jaguar IV, who they believe commissioned the building. Contextually, Bird Jaguar IV took power toward the late Classic period of the Mayan Empire, and it was 10 years after his father, who was Shield Jaguar II, had died. At this time, the Mayan Empire was very, very strong, full of wealth, and had enough money to, construct and to waste on buildings of ambiguous purpose. And the reason why that is some contextual information is because the function of this building is kind of unknown because it's hard to see from this view, but it's an extremely narrow building, very long but very narrow to the point where it wouldn't function very well. It couldn't hold very many people. There's no archaeological signs that it was a residence of any sort. So again, it might have just been some sort of government building, or it could have just been a structure that was a show of power, or perhaps it was a private building. So the function of it is pretty unknown. But again, please make note of that roof comb system and that they're built up on these platforms. So we're still, in this city of Yaxchitlan, and now we're going to be looking at a, it's called Lintel 25 and Structure 24. So the structures are the buildings, okay, that's how they're titled. So we're not really looking at structure 23, but what we're looking at is a lintel carving that is on structure 23. I know that that feels very confusing, but that's the title. So it's lintel sculpture 25 on structure 23. And again, this is the actual carving. So we talked about, having deeper carvings and more negative space. I tried to put a black and white drawing up for you to be able to see more clearly what these depictions are, and if you were to zoom into it, you would be able to get a clear rendering of what the sculpture is. And I think for AP, really, the content of this image is extremely important. So overall, this lintel originally sat above the central doorway of structure 23, and this building was dedicated to Lady Zook. And therefore, again, that is why the lintel above the central doorway features her. So Lady Zook, and I do have kind of a diagram on the next page, but Lady Zook is here on the bottom right, okay? And what she is doing is invoking the vision serpent to commemorate her husband's rise to the throne, okay? And she's holding a bowl that has some tools in it that are tools used for bloodletting. And there's like a stinging spine and from like a stingray and a blood-stained paper. Bloodletting was a very, very common practice in Mayan life from late preclassic period onwards. And it was a really essential part of rulership and of public rituals. Um, Bloodletting does not necessarily mean human sacrifice, but kind of cutting open your finger and dripping blood onto things. Giving blood in terms of ceremony and ritual was a very, very common practice. The Maya elite would draw blood from various parts of their bodies using lancets made of stingray spine, flint, um, carved bone, or obsidian. And these objects are often, found in burial. These objects and these tools are often found in burials and other archaeological contexts. Although other perishable materials like rope and bark paper strips that are depicted here on this lintel, of course, haven't survived archaeologically and are now lost. But all of the things that are depicted in the sculpture in terms of bloodletting tools are things that have been found in various tombs and areas of temples. So we understand what these tools were used for and able to interpret the this carving more accurately. So in terms of the story, the vision serpent that is being invoked by Lady Zook has two heads. One of the head is a warrior that is emerging from its mouth, and the other represents, or the other has Tlaloc, which is the war god. There's an inscription on there that's written as a mirror image. Now, remember that they use kind of pictograms, and remember we learned that from the Codex Mendoza, that they're kind of like hieroglyphics, and they're pictures that depict language. And but these pictograms are a mirror image, so really they can only be read correctly and in order when reflected. It's an extremely unusual in Mayan script. The meaning is uncertain, but perhaps it's symbolic or indicating that she's had a vision from the other side of existence, and she's probably acting as a shaman at this point. Lintels, these um, narrative carved lintels were commissioned by rulers of the city, and they provide a really lengthy dynastic record in both text and image. This here is kind of the diagram that I wanted to point out so you can understand the content of this. And again, I think that that's what's important about this image specifically. So again, just pointing out some important things. You have Lady Zook here in the corner. She's holding the bloodletting bowl. She has that typical Aztec profile of beauty. So she's invoking this serpent. Here's the serpent, okay? One of the serpent heads right here, and then this is the open mouth of the serpent head, and then coming out of the mouth of this serpent head is a warrior head, and then this is the second serpent mouth right here, and this here then represents the war god. And so moving on to kind of our last culture and civilization for part one is Aztec art. And the Aztecs are really known for famously represented by their gold and jewelry, which they really kind of mastered working with metal at this point, and abundance of their gold jewelry definitely survived over time. We also see a lot of jade and turquoise carvings. Um, we know the Aztecs really kind of they've kind of gone down in history for their aggressive nature, especially in their religious ceremonies and ritualistic ceremonies. Um, they have great terrifying deities that you'll see commonly in sculptures. And again, their characteristics include both human remains and bloody sacrifices. This is the culture known for practicing, actual human sacrifice along with bloodletting ceremonies and animal sacrifice. Um, and we're looking at, a Mesoamerican region. Um, to add to that, um, let's see. So in terms of the Aztecs, I think one of the most important understandings is their large temples. And so image 157, I think, is one of their most important temples, and it's called the Templo Mayor. And now we're in 1375 to 1520 CE. We're looking at stone. It's located in what is modern day Mexico City, but at the time it was Tenochtitlan. And again, we talked about how the um, all the earlier cultures were influencing, their after cultures. So we have this history of, the Olmecs that were then influencing the Mayans, and then the Mayans influencing the Aztecs. And so you can kind of see this lineage of cultural development and civilization. And so with the Aztecs, um, you're going to see a lot of similarities, but you're also going to see a ton of advances. So this city was laid out on a grid system, and it was definitely considered the center of the world at the time of its, of its best days. And the Templo Mayor is actually made up of two temples side by side. So what you're looking at over here to the left are, of course, what we have today, the ruins. But it's important to be able to visualize what it once looked like in its glory days. And so you have two temples, so one on the left and one on the right, each having their own staircase atop a very large pyramid. Um, the north the North Temple was dedicated to the god of war, rain, and agriculture, and then the South Temple was dedicated to the god of sun. And the grid system also allowed the Templo Mayor to be built on the cardinal points, and to also interact with a lot of the equinoxes. So the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun would rise between the two temples. And again, that was all purposely designed, part of their ritualistic beliefs and ceremonies. You also have these large, what's called braziers, which are really just large, like pit kind of fire barbecues, were put on top where sacred fires would burn. Um, the temples begun in 1375, but then were destroyed by the Aztecs in order to rebuild larger temples 6 times, okay, and then finally destroyed by the Spanish in 1520. And a new colonized city was built on top of Templo Mayor and Tenochtitlan, and the materials from the complex were reused in various structures as well as Aztec objects. But here's what is interesting. So this Templo Mayor was rebuilt 6 times, and each time, grander and larger, until it was finally destroyed in 1520. But what they did here, and that's what this image is trying to show you, is that um, the first temple was kind of like, destroyed and then filled in, and then the next temple built on top of that, and then destroyed and filled in. So all the prior kind of construction of the temples pretty much became fill for, the next ones, until we get to, the final Templo Mayor that then was, destroyed by the Spanish in 1520. So, like anything else, there is a video here that is important to watch. It's going to give you some great contextual information, will also allow you to see this complex in a more three-dimensional way, and allow you to really visualize it much, much better. So getting into some details about the Templo Mayor, this is image 157. It's called the Koyoshaki stone, and it's made of volcanic stone, which is very porous and very soft, from 1469. Again, you can see that stylistic carving where it's a deeper relief. You have negative space that's further removed. I mean, we're looking at, a huge difference in spans of time. So, tools became more sophisticated, but also a lot of these are softer stone. So volcanic stone is a very soft stone. It's easier to dig into and to carve. Originally, like I had said before, the Aztecs were known for painting their sculptures. So even though, we have the kind of relic that has been left, we know that when it was painted we could kind of imagine that it would look something like this. This is a very, very interesting piece of sculpture that is also interacts with the architectural of the Templo Mayor. So the translation of Koyoshaki means she with bells on cheeks. Okay, that's the direct translation. Um, what she was, okay, so part of Aztec culture in terms of, their rituals is they would dismember their enemies, and as kind of a not only a victorious kind of ceremony, but also part of their sacrificial ceremonies. They would dismember the enemies and throw them down the stairs of the Great Pyramid to land on the disc of Koyoshaki. So if you again take a peek, so standing up here is where they would perform a lot of their rituals, a lot of their sacrifices, their bloodlettings and things like that. And so their enemies, they would dismember them, they would throw them, their body parts, down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs, flat on the ground, was this huge stone of Koyoshaki. It's a circular relief sculpture, monolith sculpture, and the fable or the narrative that is behind Koyoshaki is that she was known that she had rallied her many brothers. So she had 400 brothers, and together they plot the death of their mother, Kodaluke. And Kodaluke became pregnant after a ball of feathers fell down her bosom while she was on top of Snake Mountain. When Koyoshaki goes to kill her mother and chop off her head, the patron god of the sun defends the mother and thus chops Koyoshaki's head off and throws her off of this shrine, this snake mountain, where she then her body lands in dismemberment. Okay, and so that's kind of the myth, the fable, the narrative behind Koyoshaki, and is now this symbol of the landing of dismembered bodies from the temple itself. Um, Again, I've included a small video in here that describes this image more in depth, allows you to understand some more of the content and the contextual information, but then gives you a really great view of this monolith sculptural stone as well. The next image that is still part of the Templo Mayor is image 57. It's called the Calendar Stone, and it's made from basalt. So what we have here is a circular shape that reflects the cyclic nature of time. It is the markings of a calendar, okay? But the function of it was also a place where rituals took place at the Templo Mayor. So this calendar stone was at the top of the temple, okay, at the altar of the temple. And again, it was laid flat. So it wasn't something that was, upright for frontal viewing, but it was flat on the ground, okay? So the image, what we have here is an image in the center, and the image of this figure that's being depicted is actually unknown. They do believe that it could be a certain god, but they also believe that it could be the ruler at the time. But what we have here is the face, and then we also have to the left and the right his hands, which are holding human hearts. But what's very important is to understand that in the center here, in this kind of widespread mouth, that actually a blade would be inserted in there to act as the tongue. And the tongue, this bladed tongue, was actually like a sacrificial flint knife that was used to kind of slash open the victim. So whenever there was any sort of bloodletting or dismembering, this was kind of the knife that was used for those ceremonial purposes. The other thing that's really important to understand about this image, and again, the video that I've posted here will talk to you about it more in detail, but you do need to understand that this is a calendar, but specifically what this calendar is depicting. So the inner circle of the calendar explains the story of the eras. So to the Aztecs, they believed that there's 5 eras, and that at the time of this calendar, they were in their 5th era, and that 4 eras before them had already passed. And basically, when I mean an era, I mean kind of like the start and the end to a civilization. And so, like, um, one of the eras, civilization had been wiped out because of wind. And one of the eras had been wiped out, because of flood. Kind of like, the story of like Noah and his ark. But the Aztecs believed that we had already been through 4 eras, that we were in our 5th era right now. And then the stone actually predicts how the 5th era will end. And I do believe that that prediction is by earthquake. The video explains how their kind of environment, that they're surrounded by a fault line and a lot of kind of active volcanoes. And so, environmentally, that kind of makes sense that the 5th era will succumb to some sort of earthquake. But then that's the inner circle. Okay, you could see these blocks for the eras, and then the outer circle, the outer ring is kind of an outline of the 20-day Aztec calendar, and then also depictions of the lunar phases. So it's important to understand, what the function of this stone was, where the stone was located in correlation to the Temple Mayor, but then also content-wise, being able to go beyond, oh, well, it's a calendar, being able to talk about the eras, to talk about the inner circle, the outer circle. That's important information. And again, the video will take a few minutes and outline it very, very clearly for you for your benefit. I was lucky enough, being a Chicagoan and being very familiar with Chicago museums. In the Field Museum, there is a replica of the calendar stone, and I took a photograph of it just to kind of share with my AP students. It was wonderful because even though it was a replica, it was to scale, so it really kind of helped you understand the size of this calendar stone, and allowed you to see some of the details a little bit better as well. This is image number 157, and the reason why it's part of this Aztec section is because these Olmec masks were found in that region. But remember, the Olmec culture came way before the Aztecs, even before the Mayans. So that's why this is included here. It was found on site, but it does belong to a different civilization. But this is the only image that we have of the Olmec culture. So these are this is called Olmec mask. Um, and basically, this is a very identifiable and stylized characteristic of their artwork and the faces that are depicted. So it's always this kind of frowned face, very large monumental scale sculptures, as well as teeny tiny little masks. So even though these are not masks, I wanted you to see that the Olmecs were known for their big, colossal heads. And they would have these large stone sculptures of heads on the ground, but in that very stylized, kind of frowned face. Um, kind of squared off head shapes, but then they also made these smaller masks out, these smaller Olmec heads out of jade that were more flat, like a mask. So on the next page, again, is a video that talks more about the masks, lets you kind of see it in a three-dimensional perspective, and talks a little bit more about the contextual information. 158 is kind of a straightforward piece. What this is literally a headdress of uh, of an Aztec ruler. There's not a lot of information on this piece, but it's a ruler's feathers headdress from 1428 to 1520. It's made of feathers and gold. But what is really, really special about this piece is it's comprised of 400 long green feathers that are the tails of this sacred Quetzal bird. And this bird, the feathers come from the male bird, and each male bird only produces 2 feathers. So again, to accumulate 400 of these feathers into one single headdress is just such an important status symbol, and such a very, very rich um, piece of costume and piece of ritualistic attire. The number 400 is a symbolic number, and it symbolizes eternity. It's the only known feather headdress in the world that we have from this time. And what we know about it is it was, taken from the Spanish and brought back to the old world, and is now, put into a museum. But again, there's not a lot of information on this piece, but you will receive some more kind of historical information from this short Khan Academy video. And that's going to wrap up part 1. When we do part 2, we'll get into our other civilizations about the Americas. And again, hopefully you are learning some interesting information, and how art really helps us understand our civilizations of the past.